My wife started filling the bathtubs on a Tuesday. I came home from the office portfolio risk analysis, the kind of job that makes you believe numbers can predict everything, and found both bathrooms sealed with duct tape around the drain stoppers, water trembling at the porcelain lip. The kitchen counters were lined with canned goods arranged by caloric density. She'd printed a spreadsheet. There were columns for protein, sodium, shelf life. I remember standing in the hallway, with my laptop bag still over my shoulder, watching her kneel beside a plastic storage bin, layering batteries between folded towels so they wouldn't rattle, and thinking, she's finally lost it. "Claire," I said in that voice, the one I'd perfected over 11 years of marriage. Patient, measured, the voice of a man who believes he is the reasonable one in every room he enters. "What is this?" She didn't look up. Closed the front door, locked the deadbolt and the chain. "It's 92 degrees outside. We need the cross breeze. Lock it, Marcus." I didn't lock it. I set my bag down on the kitchen island, opened the refrigerator, and poured myself iced tea from the pitcher she'd made that morning. The ice cubes cracked in the glass. I drank slowly because I wanted her to see how calm I was, how unperturbed. I wanted the contrast to do the work, my stillness against her strange buzzing energy, so I wouldn't have to say the condescending thing directly. She said it for me. "You think I'm crazy." "I think you're stressed. I think you've been reading too much Twitter. There's a difference." Claire stood. She was wearing cargo pants I'd never seen before, a plain gray t-shirt, and her hair was pulled into the kind of tight, functional braid she only ever wore for hiking. She looked like a different woman. Not the Claire who negotiated pharmaceutical supply contracts in pencil skirts and spoke 3 languages on conference calls. This was someone dressed for a problem that hadn't arrived yet. 16 cities are under federal quarantine, she said. Not the Twitter rumor quarantine. Actual National Guard perimeter quarantine. They announced Atlanta and Memphis at noon. The CDC brief used the word unprecedented 4 times in 6 paragraphs. The European markets closed early. The Asian markets didn't open. "I know. I work in risk analysis. The models..." "Your models are wrong." She crossed to the kitchen window and pointed east toward the Sanderson development, the half-built subdivision 3 blocks away where the construction crews had stopped showing up last week. The family on Elm Court left this morning. Both cars, mattresses strapped to the roof. The Nguyen's across the street sent their kids to Lubbock yesterday. Mrs. Carver called me at 11 to ask if we had amoxicillin because urgent care turned her away at the door. There's a respiratory thing going around. People panic. People don't strap mattresses to cars for a respiratory thing, Marcus. I drank my tea. The glass was sweating in my palm, and I focused on that small, cold circle of sensation, because it was concrete and manageable, and the look in my wife's eyes was neither of those things. She wasn't frantic. That was what unnerved me. Claire panicking I could have handled. Claire calm and organized, and already 3 steps into a plan she hadn't consulted me about that made something shift in my stomach I didn't want to name. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. Not because I was ready to act, because I wanted to manage her. "I want you to board the downstairs windows. There's plywood in the garage. I bought it this morning. I want you to move the bookcase in front of the sliding glass door. I want you to take this seriously." I rinsed my glass, set it in the sink, turned around, leaned against the counter, and folded my arms. "Sweetheart," I said, "we live in a suburb in Virginia. The nearest quarantine zone is 900 miles away. I understand that the news is scary, but this is... If you say overreacting, I will remember it. I need you to know that. I will remember that you said it. I said it anyway. The first thing you should know about Claire Ellison Moore is that she has never once in our marriage been wrong about a consequential thing. She told me to sell the condo in 2019. I argued. The market proved her right. She told me her mother's oncologist was incompetent, and we needed a second opinion at Johns Hopkins. I called her dramatic. The second opinion caught what the first one missed. She told me the contractor on our kitchen renovation was cutting corners behind the drywall. I said she was micromanaging. The inspector found exposed wiring that could have burned the house down. Every significant disagreement in our marriage has ended the same way. Claire was right, and I caught up later. And by then, the cost of my delay had already been paid in some currency money, time, her mother's lymph nodes, our kitchen wall. I knew this. I knew it the way you know a fact about yourself that you've decided not to let change your behavior. And on that Tuesday, with the bathtubs full and the canned goods stacked and my wife asking me to board the windows, I chose the pattern again. I chose to be the reasonable man who weighs evidence, who doesn't flinch at headlines, who trusts the system because the system has always been there, humming in the background, keeping the lights on and the garbage collected and the infected contained in cities that weren't mine. I did not board the windows. I went upstairs to my home office and pulled the market data. The numbers were ugly loss correlations I hadn't seen since early COVID. Liquidity gaps in sectors that shouldn't have been coupled, but ugly numbers were my profession. I could contextualize. I could model. The models said disruption, correction, volatility. The models did not say civilization. I sent 2 emails to clients, adjusted a hedge position, and felt the warm satisfaction of a man doing sensible work while the world overreacted. Downstairs, Claire boarded the windows herself. I heard the drill, the high-strained whine of screws biting into the window frames. She'd bought the plywood that morning, which meant she'd gone to Home Depot at opening, loaded it into the back of her RAV4, and driven home without asking for my help. I sat in my ergonomic chair in my climate-controlled office and listened to my wife secure our house while I reviewed a client's asset allocation. Around 6 o'clock, our neighbor David Chen knocked on the door. Claire opened it. I came halfway down the stairs and listened. "You see the news?" David said. He was a high school chemistry teacher, mid-40s, the kind of neighbor who returned your trash cans from the curb without being asked. His voice was doing something I'd never heard from him before. The words were steady, but the pitch was wrong, like a guitar string tuned a half-step too tight. "I saw it," Claire said. "Richmond's in the quarantine now. They just announced it 15 minutes ago. That's 70 miles. "I know. My sister's in Richmond. I can't reach her. The cell network's jammed." Claire handed him something. I leaned over the railing and saw it was a printout. A list, maybe a plan, something she'd assembled while I was upstairs adjusting hedge positions. David read it, nodded slowly, thanked her in a voice that cracked at the edges. When she closed the door and saw me on the stairs, her expression was perfectly neutral. No accusation, no vindication, just the flat, calm attention of someone operating inside a problem, while the person who was supposed to be her partner observed from a comfortable distance. "Richmond," I said. 70 miles. That doesn't mean... Marcus. She put her hand on the banister. Her knuckles were red from the drill. There was sawdust on her forearms. "I need to know right now. Are you going to help me, or are you going to keep score from upstairs?" The honest answer was that I didn't know. The answer I gave was the one designed to end the conversation without committing to a position. "Let me look at the data. If it gets worse, We'll reassess. She nodded once. But something left her eyes in that moment. Not love, not respect. Something more operational than either. She stopped counting on me. I didn't recognize the loss until much later. By Wednesday morning, the data had gotten worse. I woke at 5 to the sound of Claire moving through the house with purpose. When I checked my phone, 4 new quarantine zones had been declared overnight. Raleigh, Charlotte, Virginia Beach, and a corridor along I-95 that the federal alert described as a managed exclusion perimeter. The language was careful. Official language always is. But managed exclusion perimeter meant they'd close the highway. And closing a highway meant the thing they were trying to contain had reached the road. I sat on the edge of the bed and scrolled through the feeds. The official channels were behind measured updates every 4 hours, clinical terminology, reassurance architectures. But the unofficial channels were a different frequency entirely. Videos from inside Richmond that the platforms kept pulling down and that people kept re-uploading. I watched 11 seconds of one before my thumb found the pause button on instinct. 11 seconds was enough. The thing I saw a woman doing to a paramedic in a hospital parking lot was not something that belonged inside the word respiratory. I went downstairs. Claire was in the kitchen, but the kitchen didn't look like our kitchen anymore. She'd cleared the island and turned it into a staging area. First aid supplies in one zone, tools in another, food sorted into 72-hour packs wrapped in plastic. 2 backpacks sat by the garage door, already loaded. "Bug-out bags," she said without turning around. "In case we have to leave on foot." On foot? If the roads lock up, 70 miles isn't a buffer, Marcus. It's a countdown. I poured coffee. The machine still worked. The lights still worked. The refrigerator hummed its familiar pitch, and the central air pushed cool, processed air across my skin. And everything about the infrastructure of our life was still functioning, and that functioning made Claire's preparations look like theater. This is the trap. I understand it now. The systems keep performing normalcy right up until the moment they don't. And by then the gap between where you are and where you needed to be is a gap measured in hours you already spent. "I want to drive to the store," I said. We don't need anything from the store. I've accounted for 2 weeks of caloric intake for 2 adults with a 20% buffer. What we need is for you to move the bookcase." The bookcase. The 8-foot walnut unit in the living room that held my collected hardcovers and weighed approximately 400 pounds loaded. She wanted it in front of the sliding glass door. I dismissed this request yesterday as paranoid staging. Today, with Richmond 70 miles east and a managed exclusion perimeter threading down the interstate like a tourniquet, the request landed differently. I moved the bookcase. It took 40 minutes alone because the thing was massive and I had to unload the shelves first, stack the books in the hallway, wrestle the frame across the hardwood without gouging it. And even then, in the act of protecting our home, I was worried about the floor finish. Claire watched me for about 10 seconds and then left to do something more useful, which was reinforcing the garage door with 2x4s she'd pre-cut to length. Pre-cut. She'd measured our garage door, bought lumber, and cut it to specification before I'd agreed there was a problem. Around noon, David Chen came back. This time he brought his wife, Lynn, and their 14-year-old son, Kevin. Kevin was carrying a backpack and a baseball bat with electrical tape wrapped around the grip. Lynn's eyes were swollen from crying. "We can't reach anyone," David said. "Phones are down. Internet's intermittent. The news just said Fredericksburg." Fredericksburg, 50 miles. Claire looked at me. Not for permission, for logistics. We have room, but everyone works. No passengers. I opened my mouth to discuss this. My instinct was to discuss everything, to form a committee, to model the scenario. And Claire was already assigning tasks. David and Kevin to the upstairs windows, Lynn to water inventory, me to the garage barricade. I followed instructions. For the first time in my marriage, I did what Claire said without offering an improvement. It wouldn't be the last. The power went out at 3:47 p.m. on Wednesday. There was no flicker, no warning brownout, no merciful dimming to signal that the grid was struggling. One moment the house hummed with electricity, the soft circulatory pulse of modern life that you never hear until it stops, and then silence swallowed every room at once. The refrigerator's compressor clicked off. The air conditioning exhaled one last breath through the vents and went still. The digital clocks died. The charging indicator on my phone winked out like an eye closing. Claire didn't pause. She was in the garage reinforcing the side door hinges, and she simply reached to her left, picked up a flashlight she'd staged on the workbench that morning, and kept drilling. The battery-powered drill didn't care about the grid. I stood in the kitchen holding a glass of water that was still cold from the tap, the last cold water we'd have for a long time, though I didn't understand that yet, and felt something shift in the floor of my comprehension. Not the dramatic collapse of certainty, something quieter, a subsidence. The invisible support structure that allowed me to believe Claire was overreacting had been the infrastructure itself. The lights, the cooling, the signal on my phone. The hum that meant someone else was managing the large-scale problem so I could manage my small-scale skepticism. Without the hum, my skepticism had no foundation. It was just a man standing in a darkening kitchen, holding water, having been wrong. David appeared at the top of the stairs. Power's out on the whole block. I can see from Kevin's window. Nothing's lit in any direction. Generators? I asked. Claire already accounted for that. He said it gently, the way you deliver information to someone who's only now arriving at a meeting that started hours ago. She's got a solar battery bank and 3 deep-cycle marine batteries in the garage. Won't run the AC, but it'll keep the communications equipment alive. Communications equipment. I didn't even know we owned communications equipment. But Claire had purchased a hand-crank emergency radio and a set of walkie-talkies with a 5-mile range sometime in the last 72 hours. And they were sitting in a labeled plastic bin in the hall closet between the flashlights and the water purification tablets. I found her in the garage. The heat was already building without the AC. Virginia in July is a slow-motion assault. And the garage was 10 degrees worse than the house. Sweat tracked down her temples into the neck of her shirt, and she didn't wipe it. She was focused on the hinge work with the same concentration I'd seen her bring to contract negotiations. Total, methodical, immune to distraction. You planned for this, I said. Not a question. I planned for worse. How long have you been planning? She set the drill down, looked at me directly for the first time since the previous night, when I'd told her to reassess, when I'd used that word like a shield. 6 weeks, since Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge. The first domestic case cluster, back when the cable news was still calling it an anomalous behavioral pathogen, and the internet was still arguing about whether the videos were real. 6 weeks ago, Claire had started reading the primary literature, not the news summaries, not the opinion columns, the actual epidemiological preprints coming out of European labs. She'd built a spreadsheet tracking infection velocity by metro area. She'd calculated our specific geographic risk based on highway proximity, population density, and distance from the nearest military installation. She'd done all of this at night, after I went to sleep. because she already knew I would dismiss it. My wife had been preparing to save my life for 6 weeks, and she'd done it in secret because my condescension had made openness too expensive. "I'm sorry," I said. It was the first honest sentence I'd spoken since Tuesday. It hung in the hot garage air between us, insufficient and necessary. Claire picked up the drill. "Sorry is a feeling. I need your hands. Go fill every container in the house with water before the pressure drops. The municipal pumps are electric. We have hours, maybe less." I went. I filled everything. She was right about that, too. The first infected person I ever saw was Mrs. Alonso from 4 houses down. It was Thursday morning, just after dawn. I was in the upstairs hallway, moving toward the bathroom, when Kevin Chen called my name in a whisper so urgent it had edges. He was at the window of the guest bedroom, pressed against the wall beside the frame, peering through a gap in the plywood where 2 boards didn't quite meet. I looked through the gap. The street outside was empty in a way streets shouldn't be. No parked cars moved, no sprinklers ran. No one jogged with earbuds except for one figure standing on the sidewalk 3 houses east. Mrs. Alonso, 71 years old, retired postal worker. She'd brought us a peach cobbler when we moved in, and every Christmas since she'd left a tin of butter cookies on our porch with a handwritten card addressed to both of us by name. She was standing perfectly still in the center of the sidewalk, wearing a housecoat and 1 slipper. Her left foot was bare against the concrete. Her arms hung at her sides with a looseness that didn't look relaxed. It looked disconnected, like the signals between her brain and her limbs had been rerouted through something that didn't care about posture or dignity or the fact that Mrs. Alonso had served 30 years carrying mail through heat and snow and dogs because she believed in the job. "Don't move," Kevin whispered. "Just watch." A bird landed on a mailbox 10 feet from her. A mockingbird, the state bird doing its state bird thing, oblivious. It chirped twice. Mrs. Alonso's head turned toward the sound with a speed that didn't match her age or her body. Not a human turn, a mechanical acquisition, the way a surveillance camera tracks motion. Then she was still again. The bird flew. Her head didn't follow it. She resumed her stillness facing the new direction, which was now directly toward our house. Kevin pulled me back from the gap. His 14-year-old face was doing something I recognized, the rapid-fire computation of someone integrating new information into a worldview that cannot accommodate it. I'd been doing the same calculation for 2 days. He was just doing it faster because he was young enough to not have a backlog of denial to clear first. We went downstairs. Claire was already awake, already dressed, already at the kitchen table with the radio tuned low. The emergency broadcast was a loop shelter in place. Avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. Do not approach. Do not engage. Assistance is being coordinated. The loop had been running since midnight without variation, which meant either the situation was stable enough to not require updates, or the people responsible for updating it were no longer at the microphone. "Mrs. Alonso is outside," I said. Claire's hand stopped on the radio dial. A micro pause. Then she resumed scanning frequencies. "How does she look?" "Wrong." "Describe wrong." I described the stillness, the head turn, the bare foot, the disconnection between the woman I'd known for 4 years and the figure occupying her body on the sidewalk. Claire listened without interruption. Lin Chen was at the kitchen table too, her hands wrapped around an empty mug, and she closed her eyes when I finished talking. "She's the first one on our street," Claire said. "She won't be the last. The infection perimeter reached Gainesville overnight. We're inside it now." Inside it. 2 words that restructured everything. not watching the crisis on a screen, not tracking it on a map, not modeling its probability from the safety of data. Inside it. The thing was here, wearing Mrs. Alonso's housecoat, standing in the July heat on our street. And the plywood on our windows wasn't theater anymore. It was architecture. David came downstairs with Kevin. Claire laid out the new rules in simple declarative sentences. No one opens exterior doors. No one stands near windows without plywood. Movement inside the house stays quiet socks, no shoes. All conversations at speaking volume, never raised. Lights at night are forbidden because light is signal and signal is attraction. We nodded. Every one of Claire's rules made immediate sense, and every one was something she'd determined days ago while I was still arguing about whether the news was real. By Thursday afternoon, there were 6 of them on our street. I know because Kevin counted. He'd appointed himself the watcher, disciplined circuits between the upstairs windows, 3-minute intervals, a notebook where he logged position, direction, and any change in behavior. 14 years old and already building an intelligence operation from a guest bedroom while the adults process their fear in slower, less useful ways. Claire gave him the binoculars she'd bought another purchase I hadn't known about, and told him he was doing essential work. The pride in his face when she said it was a complicated thing to witness. No child should need to feel essential for that reason. The 6 were scattered along the block in a pattern that resisted analysis. 2 stood motionless in the Feldman's front yard, facing opposite directions, like broken sentries. 1 sat on the curb near the storm drain, legs extended, head tilted at an angle that suggested the neck muscles had surrendered their negotiation with gravity. Mrs. Alonso hadn't moved from her position on the sidewalk. The remaining 2 were further east, near the cul-de-sac, visible only when the afternoon light hit them at the right angle between the houses. They didn't interact with each other. They didn't vocalize. They didn't wander. They occupied space with a patience that felt borrowed from something geological. And the stillness was worse than movement would have been. Because movement you can predict, you can track, you can calculate velocity and trajectory and time to arrival. Stillness just waits. Inside, the heat built. Without air conditioning, the house became a demonstration of thermodynamics. The plywood trapped the heat as effectively as it blocked the view. And by mid-afternoon, the second floor was above 95 degrees. We consolidated to the first floor. Claire had anticipated this and staged the sleeping arrangements. Air mattresses in the living room, sheets hung as privacy dividers. The kitchen maintained as the operational center. I tried to be useful. I organized the food supplies according to Claire's system, checking her labels, confirming her math. The math was always correct. I inventoried the water. We had approximately 70 gallons in filled containers plus the 2 bathtubs, which Claire estimated at 40 gallons each. 150 gallons for 5 people. At minimum survival intake, roughly 15 days. At comfortable intake in this heat, 8. We can't stay 8 days, I said, presenting this to Claire like a finding, like I was contributing analysis. She looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize, the one where she decided in real time whether correcting me was worth the caloric expenditure. I know. The water timeline intersects with the food timeline at day 11, but neither of those is the binding constraint. What is? Them. She tilted her head toward the boarded windows. 6 today. They came from the direction of Route 7, which means the infection corridor is spreading laterally from the highway. The density will increase. At some point, the density exceeds our ability to move through them if we need to evacuate. So we have a window. We have a window that's closing, and we won't know it's closed until we try to open it. David was listening from the hallway. He came in quietly, Lynn behind him. Are you saying we should leave? Claire shook her head. I'm saying we need to decide when leaving becomes smarter than staying. And we need to decide before the math makes the choice for us. Right now, staying is correct. The house is secure, we're supplied, and movement means exposure. But there's a crossover point. What determines the crossover? David asked. Density outside, resources inside, and whether anyone comes. She said the last part without inflection, but the weight was there. Whether anyone comes, whether the managed exclusion perimeter meant we were being managed, or whether it meant we'd been excluded. That night, lying on an air mattress in our own living room, I listened to Claire breathe beside me in the dark, steady, measured, the breathing of someone who'd already made peace with the math. I hadn't. I was still catching up. I was always catching up. Friday changed the arithmetic. The radio signal, which had been looping the same shelter-in-place message for 36 hours, finally updated at dawn. Claire was already awake. I'm not sure she'd slept, and she shook my shoulder when the new voice came through. Not the synthetic calm of the previous recording. A live human, audibly exhausted, reading from a script that hadn't been polished. All residents within the Route 7 to Interstate 66 corridor between Leesburg and Centerville are advised that evacuation routes have been established along Sully Road, heading south to the staging area at Manassas National Battlefield Park. Military escort will be provided at designated pickup points. Pickup points are active from 0600 to 1800 daily. After 1800, you are strongly advised to shelter in place. Do not travel after dark. Repeat, do not travel after dark. Claire was already at the table with a road map, a paper road map, the kind no one under 40 has used voluntarily in a decade, purchased at a gas station by a woman who understood that GPS requires satellites, and satellites require a civilization that might not be available. She traced the route with her finger. Our house to Sully Road was 4.7 miles, mostly residential streets, 2 intersections with arterial roads, 1 stretch of open ground where the new development hadn't finished construction. 4.7 miles, she said. On foot, carrying packs, moving carefully, that's 2 to 3 hours. If we leave at first light, we reach Sully by 9. The pickup points are active until 6. That's a 9-hour buffer. If the pickup points are real, I said. She looked at me. That's a live broadcast, Marcus. Someone is sitting at a microphone right now, running on no sleep, telling people where to go. I'm going to believe them. And if the route is compromised, if the density between here and Sully, then we adapt. But staying here until the water runs out and the density increases to the point where we can't move at all is not adaptation. It's just a slower way to lose. David and Lynn joined the conversation. Kevin had already done a dawn count from the upstairs windows. 14 infected visible on our street and the adjacent cross streets. More than double yesterday's count. The growth rate was accelerating, which matched the infection velocity curves Claire had been tracking since Baton Rouge. Exponential in the early phase, then density limited. But we were nowhere near the density ceiling. The decision was not a vote. Claire laid out the math water timeline, food timeline, density projection, route distance, pickup window, and the math made the decision self-evident. We would leave Saturday at first light. We had 24 hours to prepare. That day was the day I became useful. Not because I suddenly acquired survival skills or overcame my fundamental nature. I became useful because Claire finally gave me a task that matched what I actually am. A man who organizes information and calculates margins. She assigned me the route analysis. I sat with the paper map and Kevin's observation logs and plotted every known infected position on a hand-drawn overlay. I calculated sight lines from the streets we'd need to cross. I identified 2 points where the route passed within 50 yards of observed clusters and marked alternate paths. It was risk analysis. The same cognitive architecture I used for portfolio management, applied to 4.7 miles of suburban Virginia occupied by people who weren't people anymore. I was good at it. Not good the way Claire was good. She operated on intuition backed by preparation. A combination I'd never been able to replicate, but good in my narrow, specific, spreadsheet native way. When I presented the route analysis to Claire that evening, she studied it for 2 full minutes without speaking. Then she made 3 modifications: an alternate path through a drainage easement I'd overlooked, a rest point in a concrete bus shelter, a contingency route if the main road was blocked at the school crossing, and nodded. "This is good work," she said. 3 words. The first genuine professional respect my wife had shown me in 4 days. I held them like water. Friday night was the longest night. Not because anything happened. Because everything waited. And waiting in the dark inside a boarded house, with 14 confirmed infected on the surrounding streets and a 4.7-mile walk ahead of you at dawn, is a specific kind of psychological environment that I lack the vocabulary to name, but that I will never fail to recognize again. We organized in silence. Claire packed the bug-out bags with ruthless efficiency calories, water, first aid, 1 change of socks each, no luxury, no sentiment. I watched her remove a framed photograph of our wedding from the mantel, look at it for 3 seconds, and set it back down. The bag didn't have room for the frame. She didn't take the photo out of the frame. She made the cut clean and moved on. I couldn't do that. I put my grandfather's pocket watch in my bag. It weighed 4 ounces and served no survival function, and Claire saw me do it and said nothing. That silence was a kindness I didn't deserve and recognized completely. David sharpened a garden machete on the back porch, a flat stone. Rhythmic strokes, the sound intimate and ancient in the powerless dark. Kevin sat beside him, learning the motion. Lynn was inside, quietly crying in the downstairs bathroom, running the faucet to mask the sound, even though there was no water pressure anymore. The pipes had gone dry around noon, exactly when Claire had predicted. At 10 p.m., something changed outside. The infected had been stationary all day. Their daytime pattern was stillness, that terrible geological patience, but in the dark, movement returned. Not coordinated movement, nothing that suggested communication or strategy, but a slow, directionless drift, like particles in suspension, Brownian and purposeless, but covering ground. Through the gaps in the plywood, we could see shadows passing on the street, sometimes close. Sometimes a shape would stop directly outside our window and stand for minutes that felt hydraulic before moving on. Claire gathered us in the kitchen. 5 people around an island in the dark, speaking in whispers. She laid out the movement plan. Departure at 5:15 a.m. First gray light. Claire on point. David at the rear with the machete. Kevin in the center with Lynn. Me beside Claire carrying the route map. Movement was single file. Stay tight, no talking above a whisper. If we encounter infected, we freeze. They respond to sound more than sight in low light, this from the European research papers Claire had been reading for weeks. If one detects us, we do not run. We walk at speed in the opposite direction and reroute. "What if we can't reroute?" Lynn asked. Her voice was thin and scraped, but she was asking the operational question. And Claire answered it without softening. "Then David and I create a gap, and you 3 move through it." "Create a gap," David repeated. Not questioning, confirming. His hand went to the machete on his belt and rested there with a familiarity that hadn't existed 3 days ago. "I don't want you in front," I told Claire. Not a request. Something rawer. "I should be on point. I have the route memorized." "You have the route memorized. I have the judgment. If something changes, you'll try to recalculate. I'll adapt. I'm on point." She was right. She was right. And I knew she was right, and the knowing burned in a location I couldn't place. Not pride exactly, not shame exactly, something in the space between those two that I think might be the actual sensation of growing up at 43 years old. "Okay," I said. Claire reached across the island in the dark and squeezed my hand once. Brief, firm, not romantic, operational, a commander confirming that a subordinate is in position. I squeezed back and meant, "I see you. I should have seen you sooner. I will follow where you lead." We didn't sleep. We waited. 5 people breathing in a dark kitchen, packs ready, route memorized, listening to the soft, irregular footfalls outside as the infected drifted through our neighborhood like weather. At 4:45 a.m., Claire stood up. "Time," she said. The air outside was a living thing. Claire opened the back door, the one that faced the fenced yard, away from the street and the pre-dawn heat pressed against us like a body. July in Northern Virginia at 5 in the morning shouldn't feel aggressive, but the accumulated days without wind, the pavement radiating stored thermal energy, the absence of any air conditioning exhaust from any house on the block, it created an atmosphere that felt used. Breathed in and breathed out by too many lungs, most of them no longer operating on normal metabolic instructions. We moved through the backyard in single file. Claire first, then me, Kevin, Lynn, David last, machete held low along his thigh. The grass was brittle under our feet, no sprinklers for days. And each step produced a small, dry crunch that sounded, in that silence, like a scream. The fence gate opened onto the Hendersons' backyard. The Hendersons were gone. Their cars had disappeared Tuesday night, and their yard connected through a gap in the hedge to the Martindale property, which backed onto Orchard Street. This was the route I'd plotted. A chain of backyards avoiding the main road for the first half-mile, using property lines and hedge gaps instead of sidewalks. The first 200 yards were clean. Empty yards, empty houses. The gray light showing us a world that looked exactly like suburbia, except subtracted every object in its place. Trash cans at curbs, garden hoses coiled, but no people, no sound, no motion. The stillness had a quality I associate now with photographs of Pripyat after Chernobyl. Everything preserved, everything abandoned. The infrastructure of ordinary life, maintained by momentum after the lives themselves had departed. Claire moved with an efficiency that made me feel clumsy by association. Her steps were deliberate, weight placed toe first, body low passing windows. She'd studied this. Somewhere in the 6 weeks of nighttime preparation, my wife had read about tactical movement and internalized it so thoroughly that her body moved through hostile ground like it had done this before. I tried to mirror her. I failed. My foot hit a garden gnome in the Martindale yard, and it toppled against a stone border with a ceramic clap that split the silence. Everyone froze. Claire's hand came up a fist, the universal stop signal, and we stood in the Martindale's vegetable garden, motionless, breathing through our noses, listening. 10 seconds. 20. The dawn birds resumed their tentative calls. Nothing else stirred. Claire's hand opened. We moved. At the end of Orchard Street, we had to cross Maple Avenue, a 4-lane arterial road with a median, 120 feet of open pavement with no cover. I'd marked this as Risk Point Alpha on the route map. Claire had identified the drainage easement 50 yards east as the alternate crossing, but the direct route was faster, and faster meant less exposure time. She stopped behind the last house on Orchard and peered around the corner. I watched her scan left, right, hold, scan again. Then she turned to us and held up 3 fingers. 3 infected. On Maple Avenue, visible. She pointed east. The drainage easement. We backtracked 50 yards in a crouch along a privet hedge and found the concrete channel of the 3-foot-deep stormwater ditch that ran under Maple Avenue through a culvert. Claire went first, dropping into the channel and moving in a low crouch through standing water that came up to her shins. The water was stagnant and warm, and smelled of algae and the chemical residue of lawn treatments. And wading through it in the pre-dawn dark, while infected stood above us on the road, was a sensory experience that compressed fear into something dense and physical, something I could feel in my teeth. Kevin slipped on the concrete bed. His knee hit the water with a splash that echoed inside the culvert like a drum. Lynn caught his arm. David pressed a hand over his own mouth to suppress the instinctive gasp. We froze again. Above us, on the road, a sound. Footsteps. Slow, uneven. Moving toward the culvert opening. Claire looked back at me in the gray light, and her eyes said one word. Still. We were still. The footsteps stopped 14 feet above our heads. I know the distance because I could see the infected shadow on the concrete slope of the culvert entrance, elongated by the low morning sun, distorted into something tall and liquid, and motionless in a way that shadows shouldn't be, because shadows belong to things that breathe and shift weight and fidget. This shadow was a column, fixed, attentive. We stood in the drainage water. 5 people in a concrete tube, thigh-deep in stagnant runoff, not breathing. Kevin's hand was locked on Lynn's forearm, knuckles white, his 14-year-old body rigid with the effort of producing 0 sound. David's other hand was on the machete. Claire's eyes were fixed on the shadow with the analytical attention she brought to contract language reading, interpreting, waiting for the clause that would change the terms. The shadow moved. 1 step, toward the culvert mouth. Then it stopped again. 30 seconds of absolute stasis. The water around our legs produced tiny ambient sounds, the barely audible gurgle of slow drainage, the occasional drip from the culvert ceiling. And each of those micro sounds registered in my adrenaline-soaked brain as catastrophic. Surely the thing above us could hear the water. Surely it could smell us. Surely. Then the shadow turned and moved away. The footsteps, that slow, metronomic, wrong-gated shuffle, receded east along Maple Avenue and faded. Claire waited 90 full seconds. I counted them by my own pulse, which was running at approximately 140 beats per minute. So the counting was fast, but the waiting was still eternal. Then she raised her hand, pointed forward, and we moved through the culvert to the other side. We emerged on Braddock Road, residential, narrower, lined with townhomes that backed onto a strip of trees before the commercial zone. Claire checked the map against the terrain, confirmed our position, and led us south along the tree line. The first mile had taken 47 minutes, 3.7 remaining. The townhome section was a different kind of danger. The homes were closer together, windows overlooking our path. And several had doors that stood open, not broken, just open, as if the occupants had left in a hurry or hadn't left at all. Claire skirted wide around every open door. When we passed one unit where a curtain moved on the second floor, moved in a house with no power and therefore no air conditioning, and therefore no air current, she accelerated the group without a word, just a quickened pace that we matched instinctively. Behind us, Something fell inside that house. A heavy thud. Glass broke. The sound was domestic and ordinary and completely terrifying. We didn't run. Claire didn't run, so we didn't run. She increased to a fast walk, fluid and controlled, and we matched her. 5 people moving in tight formation down a suburban street while something emerged from a townhouse 40 yards behind us. I looked back. David hissed at me not to, but I looked. It was a man, young, athletic build, wearing gym shorts and a compression shirt, the kind of outfit you'd put on for a morning run. He stood in the doorway of the townhome, and his head tracked us with that same mechanical acquisition I'd seen in Mrs. Alonzo, not the fluid motion of a human following movement with their eyes, but the discreet angular snap of something locking onto a target. He stepped off the porch. "Claire," I whispered. "I know. Don't change pace." He took another step, then another. His gait was hitched, left leg dragging slightly, but the forward momentum was purposeful. He wasn't drifting. He was following. Claire turned left into an alley between 2 commercial buildings, a dry cleaner and a dentist's office. The signage absurd in context, and the alley narrowed to a corridor barely wide enough for single file. We moved through it fast, emerged onto a parking lot behind a strip mall, and cut diagonally toward the tree line that bordered the next residential section. When I checked behind us at the parking lot's edge, the alley mouth was empty. We kept moving. Claire's pace didn't slow until we'd put 3 blocks between us and the townhomes. Mile 2 brought us the Garcias. We heard them before we saw them, a sound so ordinary it short-circuited my threat response and rebooted something human in its place. A child crying. Not a scream, not terror. The exhausted, rhythmic crying of a small child who has been awake too long, who is hot and hungry and confused, and whose tears have become less an expression of acute distress than a baseline operating frequency. Claire raised her fist. We stopped. The sound came from inside a minivan parked in the driveway of a brick colonial on Sycamore Lane. The van's windows were fogged with condensation from inside breath, body heat, a sealed space in July. And as we approached, a face appeared at the driver's window. A woman, mid-30s, eyes scanning us with a fear so concentrated it had become its own kind of stillness. Claire raised both hands, palms out. "We're alive. We're heading to the Sully Road pickup point." The window cracked 2 inches. "How many?" The woman's voice was hoarse. 5, 3 adults, 1 teenager. We're not armed." A pause. "Well, he has a machete." David raised the garden tools sheepishly. The window opened further. The woman was Elena Garcia. The child in the back seat was her son, Mateo, age 3. Her husband, Javier, was sitting in the passenger seat with his left arm wrapped in a blood-soaked dish towel. The blood was dried, which meant the wound was old. Elena's eyes moved to Claire's face and stayed there with the magnetism of a person who has been making decisions alone for too long and recognizes a decision-maker. "My husband fell through a window getting us out of the house," Elena said. It's a cut. Glass. He's not infected." The clarification landed with its full weight. She'd had to say that sentence before to someone who hadn't believed it. I could hear the scar tissue in the words. Claire looked at Javier's arm. She looked at Elena, as she looked at Mateo, whose crying had downshifted to hiccups at the appearance of new people. "Can he walk?" Claire asked. "Yes." "How far have you driven?" "We can't drive. The roads are blocked at the intersection. Cars everywhere just stopped. We've been in the van since yesterday afternoon." 20 hours. In a sealed minivan. In July. with a 3-year-old and an injured man. The interior of that vehicle must have reached 130 degrees during the day. The fact that they were alive and coherent was a testament to something I didn't have a word for, not luck, not toughness. Something more fundamental about what a mother will endure when the alternative is stepping into a world where misses. Alonzo stands on the sidewalk with one slipper and a head that turns like a gun turret. Claire didn't hesitate. "Get your things. You're coming with us. 2.3 miles to the pickup. Stay in formation. Can you carry him if he weakens?" This last question was directed at me. At me. Not at David, who was stronger. Not in general. At me, specifically. Because Claire was testing something, whether I would accept an assignment that required physical burden and in service of a stranger, whether the man who dismissed her preparations would now carry their consequences. "Yes," I said. She handed Elena a water bottle from our supplies. One of our calculated, finite supply of water bottles. She gave it without consulting me, without consulting anyone. Because consultation would have cost time, and Claire had learned weeks ago that I would waste time deliberating about what she already knew was right. Javier drank. Mateo drank. Elena drank last. Then she picked up her son, put him on her hip, and stepped into formation behind Kevin with the practiced ease of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this, not rescue, but direction. Someone to say, "Here is the plan, here is your place in it. Move." Our group was 7 now. The math had changed. Claire didn't recalculate aloud. She just walked. The school crossing was the worst of it. I'd marked it Risk Point Beta on my route map. The intersection where Braddock Road crossed the entrance to Westfield Elementary. A wide-open junction with 150 feet of exposure and clear sight lines in 4 directions. No hedge cover, no drainage option. Just asphalt and a crossing guard station and a painted crosswalk where children had walked to school 3 weeks ago. Claire stopped us in the tree line 50 yards from the intersection and studied it for a full 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, I watched her face perform a calculation that no spreadsheet could model: the integration of visual data, risk tolerance, group capability, and the specific quality of silence that either means safe or means something waiting. The intersection looked empty. That was the problem. The other risk points had shown us visible infected we could count, track, and avoid. This one showed us nothing, and nothing could mean anything. "I don't like it," David said very quietly. "Neither do I." Claire turned to the group. "We cross in 2 waves. First wave, David, Kevin, Lynn fast walk, straight line, into the school parking lot and behind the building. If you draw attention, don't stop, get to cover. Second wave follows 30 seconds later. Me, Marcus, Elena, Javier, Mateo." "Why split?" I asked. "Because if the first group triggers a response, the second group reroutes. If we all cross together and something comes, 7 people with a 3-year-old and an injured man can't maneuver." The logic was flawless and cruel. The first wave was the probe. David, Kevin, and Lynn were being asked to test the intersection with their bodies. David understood this. I watched him process it, accept it, and nod. Lynn took Kevin's hand. Kevin looked at his mother, then at Claire, then at the empty intersection, and straightened his spine in a way that added 2 years to his posture. 30 seconds, Claire said. Go. David moved first. Fast walk, shoulders forward, machete in hand. Kevin and Lynn followed. Tight on his heels, 3 figures crossing the open asphalt in the morning light. They reached the median, crossed, hit the school parking lot, rounded the corner of the building. Silence. Claire counted to 30. I know because her lips moved. Now. We moved. Elena had Matteo against her chest, his face buried in her neck. And she moved with the particular efficiency of a woman accustomed to carrying 40 pounds of child through spaces not designed for it. Javier walked under his own power. Left arm cradled, jaw set. I flanked them on the exposed side, which meant I was the outermost body, the first thing any infected would see from the east or north. Claire had positioned me there without comment. The shield, the expendable margin, the man who owed a debt measured in 6 weeks of dismissed preparation. We were 30 feet from the school when Matteo lifted his head and said, clearly in the bright, curious voice of a 3-year-old who has spotted something interesting. "Mama, man?" Elena's hand went to the back of his head and pressed his face into her shoulder. I looked where Matteo had been looking. East, down the road. 200 yards away, at the edge of the residential section, a group. Not a pair, not a handful. A group emerging from between houses and onto the road, moving in our direction with that slow, purposeful gait I'd seen from the townhome man. 8, 10, more behind them. "Move," Claire said. Not a whisper, a command. We ran. Javier ran. Elena ran with Matteo bouncing against her chest. I ran beside them and heard my own breathing fill the morning air, advertising our position to everything within earshot. And it didn't matter because the group behind us had already oriented. I could hear them accelerate, not to a sprint, but to a sustained jog. That terrible middle speed that suggested they could maintain it longer than we could. We rounded the school building. David grabbed Javier's good arm. Kevin held the fence gate open. Claire came through last, pulled it shut, and wedged the machete through the chain link. 30 seconds of margin, maybe less. She was already finding the next route. Behind the school was a service road that ran parallel to the athletic fields, and beyond the fields was a strip of pine trees that bordered the commercial zone on Sully Road. 1.1 miles. Claire led us down the service road at a jog, Javier stumbling but moving. Elena's arms locked around Matteo, Kevin running with the easy stride of a kid who still had reserves the rest of us had burned through. The fence wouldn't hold the group behind us. It wasn't designed to hold anything. It was a school fence, built to keep basketballs from rolling into traffic. And the machete wedged through the latch was a gesture, not a solution. Claire knew this. She didn't look back. Looking back was my job now, the job she'd given me by position, and I performed it, glancing over my shoulder every 15 seconds to track the distance between us and whatever came through that gate. They came through at the 40-second mark. The chain links sang as they hit at a musical, almost decorative sound, and then they were on the service road behind us. That middle-speed jog, 8 or 10 shapes in the morning sun, casting shadows that reached toward us across the pavement. "Faster," Claire said. And it was the first time her voice carried something other than command. There was an edge there, a vibration. My wife was afraid, and hearing it made me faster, not because fear was contagious, but because her fear was so rare that its appearance meant the math had turned. We reached the athletic fields. The track surrounded a football field, the artificial turf already radiating heat. And beyond it was the pine tree line. Claire cut across the field diagonally shortest path, and our group of 7 stretched into a ragged line, speed dictated by the slowest member. That was Javier. His face was gray, the dish towel on his arm showing fresh red seeping through the dried brown. And his jog had degraded to a shuffling trot. Elena was beside him, free hand on his back, pushing, guiding, refusing to let the physics of his injury dictate the geometry of their survival. I dropped back, without Claire telling me to, without calculating the risk. I dropped back to Javier's left side and put my arm under his right shoulder and took weight, and we moved together. Faster. The three of us. Me, Javier, Elena with Mateo. A unit operating on the shared understanding that falling behind here meant not falling behind in a recoverable way. David was at the tree line, holding branches apart, creating an opening. Kevin was already through. Lynn was through. Claire stood at the gap and counted us in: David, me, Javier, Elena, Mateo. And she came through last and let the branches close behind us. The pine trees were dense. Visibility dropped to 20 feet. The ground was carpeted in needles that compressed silently under our weight. And the sudden shift from open field to enclosed forest changed the acoustic environment completely. Our breathing, which had been swallowed by open air, now reflected off tree trunks and came back to us, intimate and amplified. Claire stopped, listened. The group from the school was still in the field. I could hear them. A collective sound, like uncoordinated footfall, spreading across the turf, but the tree line seemed to disrupt their tracking. The sound pattern became confused, directionally scattered. They were searching, but not finding. Quiet movement. Single file. Southeast. Claire's whisper was barely vocalized. Sully Road is 400 yards through these trees. We moved. Single file. Silent on the pine needles. Javier's weight on my shoulder was substantial but manageable, and I carried it with an attention that felt devotional. This man I'd never met. This wound I hadn't caused. This family that Claire had added to our group without asking my permission because she understood what I was still learning. That the math isn't 5 people's water divided by 7 people's thirst. The math is whether you can look at the life you saved and know you deserve to survive it. 400 yards. Through the trees, I could see pavement. A road. Sully Road. The pickup point was a parking lot. A grocery store parking lot, to be precise. The Safeway at the corner of Sully Road and Westfield Boulevard. Its plate glass windows intact. Its electronic doors sealed. Its parking lot occupied not by cars, but by 2 National Guard trucks, a medical tent, and approximately 40 civilians arranged in clusters on the asphalt, sitting on luggage and coolers and folded blankets. Waiting with the patient desperation of people who have been promised something by an authority they're no longer sure exists. A soldier saw us emerge from the tree line. He raised a hand, palm out, stopped and spoke into a radio on his shoulder. A second soldier approached with a clipboard and a thermal scanner. "How many in your group?" 7, Claire said. 1 injured glass laceration, left forearm, approximately 48 hours old. 1 child, age 3. The rest are ambulatory. The soldiers scanned each of us. Temperature checks. The infrared gun pointed at each forehead in sequence, a ritual that took 8 seconds per person and felt like a verdict. Javier's scan took longer. The soldier checked the reading, checked it again, looked at Javier's arm. "How did the injury happen?" "Went through a window," Elena said. "Getting us out of our house. It's a cut. Glass." The same sentence, the same defensive precision. But the soldier just nodded and wrote something on the clipboard and waved us through to the medical tent. Inside the tent, a medic unwrapped Javier's arm with the practice detachment of someone who'd unwrapped 100 arms today and knew what she was looking for. The wound was deep, ugly, but clean-edged glass, not teeth. The medic irrigated it, applied butterfly strips, wrapped it in fresh gauze. Javier sat on a folding chair and watched her work with the expression of a man who was allowing himself, for the first time in 2 days, to believe he might not die. Elena sat next to him, Matteo asleep on her lap. The boy had fallen asleep the moment they sat down. That instantaneous surrender to exhaustion that only children can perform. The body's refusal to process one more moment of wakefulness. His face was peaceful. His small hands were curled against his mother's shirt. I found Claire outside the tent, standing at the edge of the parking lot, looking back the way we'd come. The tree line was visible 300 yards north. Beyond it, invisible from here but vivid in memory, was the school, the intersection, the townhomes, the culvert, our street, our house. The entire route compressed into a line of trees and a column of air shimmering with heat. "We made it," I said. She didn't answer immediately. She was counting. I could see it in her eyes, that quiet calculation she performed constantly, the ongoing integration of data into assessment. She was counting the people in the parking lot. She was counting the soldiers. She was counting the trucks and the medical tents and the water jugs, and performing the same resource-to-population ratio she'd performed in our kitchen 3 days ago. "Claire, we made it." She said it the way you confirm a fact on a spreadsheet. Accurate, verified, filed. Then she turned to me, and her face did something I'd never seen before, a controlled release, like a pressure valve opening by degrees. Her jaw softened. Her shoulders dropped 1 inch. Her eyes, which had been operating in wide-angled tactical mode for 72 hours, narrowed to the focal length of a single human being. "Me." "You carried him," she said. "You told me to. I asked if you could. I didn't tell you to drop back. That was you." I didn't know what to say to that. The compliment felt structural, not praise, but diagnosis, as if she'd identified a load-bearing change in my architecture and was noting it for the record. "I should have listened to you from the beginning," I said. "Tuesday, the bathtubs, all of it." "Yes, you should have." No softening, no consolation, just the fact, clean-edged like Javier's wound. I loved her for it. The convoy didn't leave until 3 in the afternoon. 8 hours in a grocery store parking lot, baking in July heat, waiting for enough vehicles to form a column that the military considered defensible. During those hours, the civilian population of the pickup point swelled from 40 to over 100 as groups filtered in from surrounding neighborhoods, some organized like ours, some alone, some carrying nothing, some carrying absurd things. A man in a business suit with a rolling briefcase, a teenage girl cradling a cat in a laundry basket, an elderly couple sharing a single cane between them, trading it back and forth depending on whose hip was worse. Claire spent the waiting hours doing what Claire does. She organized. She triaged the arriving civilians by medical need, directing the injured to the medic tent, identifying 3 people with nursing backgrounds and deputizing them to manage the growing queue. She found 2 coolers of ice in the Safeway's loading dock. The store's backup freezer had maintained partial temperature for 48 hours after the grid failed and distributed the ice to the families with children and elderly. She created a shade rotation using tarps from the military trucks, calculating sun position by hour so the shade moved with the people instead of people moving with the shade. The soldiers watched her work with a kind of professional recognition. One of them, a staff sergeant named Alderman, approached her with a clipboard he'd been using to track arrivals and offered it to her without explanation. She took it. The transfer of authority was so natural it didn't register as unusual until I saw it from across the parking lot and understood what was happening. A uniformed military professional had assessed the command structure of a parking lot full of civilians and identified Claire as the ranking officer. My wife. The pharmaceutical supply chain negotiator who'd been dismissed by her own husband 3 days ago was now running the logistics of a military evacuation point. And no one who observed her in action questioned it for a second. I helped where I could. I carried water. I set up tarps. I walked the perimeter when aldermen asked for volunteers, scanning the surrounding roads for movement, reporting what I saw. The work was physical and simple, and it filled the hours without requiring me to think about what was behind us, or what was ahead of us, or the sound Mateo had made when he said "man" in his clear, curious voice. David and Lynn sat together on a curb, Kevin between them. The family arranged in a configuration I recognized from my own failed marriage, the instinctive geometry of parents bracketing a child. Body language saying, "You are between us. Nothing comes through." My ex-wife and I had done that with our daughter once, at a fireworks show when the crowd pressed close. The memory was so specific and so out of place that it arrived like a physical object, heavy, sharp-edged, dropped into my chest from a height. I didn't have a daughter waiting for me at the evacuation destination. I had a wife I'd been married to for 11 years and had only begun to see clearly in the last 72 hours. And the seeing was not the revelatory sunlit moment that stories prepare you for. The seeing was slow and cumulative and accompanied by the understanding that I had wasted years of proximity, years of sleeping beside, eating beside, living beside on a version of Claire I'd constructed to make myself feel competent by comparison. The real Claire was standing by a military truck, clipboard in hand, redirecting a family of 4 to the shade rotation while simultaneously explaining water rationing to aldermen. The real Claire was the person who had seen the thing coming and built the plan, and carried us through 4.7 miles of hostile ground, and taken in strangers and distributed ice, and organized 100 people in a parking lot because the crisis required it, and she was the one who could. The real Claire had always been this person. I was the one who hadn't been able to afford to notice. The convoy moved south at 15 miles per hour. 3 trucks, a Humvee at the front, a Humvee at the rear, 112 civilians packed into canvas-covered truck beds, sitting on benches and on the floor, children on laps, elderly propped against duffel bags. The whole assembly vibrating with the diesel rhythm of vehicles that were designed for terrain, worse than this, and operated with the indifferent efficiency of machines that don't distinguish between one mission and the next. Claire sat beside me on the bench. Her thigh was pressed against mine. There was no room for any other configuration, and the physical contact was the first sustained touch we'd shared since Tuesday night, when we'd still slept in our bed, when the house still had power, when I'd still believed that my wife's preparation was the problem and my calm was the solution. She was asleep. Not the light, ready-to-wake sleep I'd seen her manage in the kitchen during the dark hours. Real sleep. Head against my shoulder, weight committed, breathing deep. The clipboard was still in her hand, resting on her knee, and even in sleep her fingers maintained their grip. The data, the list, the plan, she held them even when her conscious mind surrendered. I put my arm around her. Not to hold her up, to hold her, period. To be the thing she leaned against while the truck carried us south, away from the house where she'd filled the bathtubs and I'd poured iced tea, away from the street where Mrs. Alonso stood in one slipper, away from the school crossing and the culvert and the drainage water and the pine trees and the 4.7 miles that had measured the distance between what I thought my marriage was and what it actually contained. Across the truck bed, Elena was watching me. Mateo was asleep in her arms, Javier asleep beside her. She met my eyes with an expression I couldn't parse at first, not gratitude, not solidarity, something more specific. Then I understood. She was looking at a man holding his sleeping wife and recognizing the posture. The configuration, the geometry of someone who has been carried and knows it and is trying to learn the shape of carrying back. David was talking quietly with aldermen near the tailgate. Logistics of the destination. The staging area at Manassas was a temporary camp. Military managed, with triage and registration, and the promise of further evacuation to a permanent safe zone whose location wasn't being disclosed over open channels. David absorbed this information with the steady pragmatism of a chemistry teacher: variables, constraints, outcomes. He'd already begun planning the next phase. Not because he was unaffected by what we'd come through, but because the Chens operated on a family frequency where planning was love, and the next task was the next expression of it. Kevin was writing in his notebook, still logging, position, time, observations. The truck's motion made his handwriting jagged, but the entries were consistent, structured, detailed, disciplined. I leaned forward and caught a glimpse of one line. 0742. Crossed school field, approximately 10 infected in pursuit, lost in tree line. The clinical precision of it was both admirable and heartbreaking. A boy his age should be logging video game achievements, not infected headcounts. The convoy turned onto a secondary road. Through the canvas gap at the rear, I could see the highway we'd avoided, I-66, normally a river of commuter traffic, now a frozen tableau of abandoned vehicles, some with doors open, some with windows broken, all empty or appearing empty. The military route deliberately skirted the major arteries. Aldermen had mentioned that the highways were compromised. The infection had spread along travel corridors first, the logical consequence of a population that responded to the first signs of collapse by getting in their cars and driving. Claire had known this too. She'd chosen the backyard route, the drainage route, the pedestrian route, because she'd understood that the infrastructure of escape would become the infrastructure of transmission. She stirred against my shoulder, settled deeper, slept on. I held her and watched the road unspool behind us. The camp at Manassas was a small city made of tents and purpose. We arrived at dusk. The parking lot of the Battlefield Visitor Center had been transformed into a processing hub, registration tables under fluorescent field lights, medical screening stations, family reunification boards covered in handwritten names and descriptions and photographs, taped to corkboard, with a desperate specificity of people trying to make their loved ones findable. Maria Santos, 67, silver hair, scar on left hand, last seen Centerville. James and Thomas Park, ages 8 and 11, maybe with grandmother. Blue backpacks. The board was 40 feet long, and every inch was covered. Claire woke when the truck stopped. She straightened, checked the clipboard, checked me, checked the group. All present, all ambulatory. She'd run the count before her eyes were fully open. We registered. Names, addresses, medical conditions, emergency contacts. The form asked for skills. Claire listed supply chain logistics, crisis management, resource allocation. I listed financial risk analysis, data modeling. The woman at the registration table looked at Claire's form, looked at Claire, and said, "Report to the operations tent at 0600. Ask for Colonel Vasquez." She hadn't looked at my form that way. The camp's residential section was organized by arrival group. We were assigned adjacent tents, one for Claire and me, one for the Chens, one for the Garcias. The tents were military surplus, 8-person capacity. Canvas walls that breathed in the evening breeze after the sealed stucco oven of our boarded house. There were cots with thin mattresses. There were battery-powered lanterns. There was a communal water station 3 rows over, staffed by volunteers. I sat on the cot in our tent and removed my shoes. My socks were stiff with dried drainage water. My feet were blistered in 3 places. My right shoulder ached where Javier's weight had compressed the joint for the mile through the pine trees. These were the physical receipts of the day, and I cataloged them not with pride, but with a plain awareness that they existed and were mine. Claire sat across from me on her cot, unlacing her boots with methodical efficiency. Her cargo pants were mud-stained to the knees. Her braid had loosened, strands of dark hair framing a face that was sunburned and drawn and still operating with a focus that hadn't diminished since Tuesday. "Colonel Vasquez," I said, "they want you in operations." "I heard. You're going to run this place within a week." She looked up from her boots. The lantern light caught her face at an angle that showed the exhaustion she'd been metabolizing for days. The hollows under her eyes, the tightness at her temples, the fine lines at the corners of her mouth that I associated with her contract negotiation face, but now understood were the lines of sustained command. "I'm going to do what needs doing," she said. "That's all I've ever done." The sentence carried 11 years of marriage in it. 11 years of doing what needed doing: the tax filings, the medical appointments, the house maintenance, the emergency preparations, the grocery inventories, the social logistics, the emotional labor, while I occupied myself with the things I chose to do and called it partnership. "I know," I said. And I meant, I know now. I didn't know before. The not knowing was a choice I made every day, and I am done making it. She nodded. Not the operational nod she'd used on the route. A different one. Slower. Something in it that acknowledged the sentence under my sentence. Then she lay back on the cot and closed her eyes. "Set the alarm for 05:30, she said. "I want 15 minutes to review the camp layout before I report." I set the alarm on my watch, the only timekeeping device between us that still worked. A mechanical piece my grandfather had worn. The same pocket watch I'd put in the bag. The 4 ounces of useless sentiment that had turned out to be the only clock we had. Claire was asleep in 90 seconds. I lay in the dark and listened to the camp breathe. The morning Claire reported to Colonel Vasquez was the morning I understood what our marriage would become. I walked her to the operations tent, not because she needed escort, because I wanted to stand beside her when she entered a space where her competence would be recognized by people who hadn't spent 11 years explaining it away. Selfish, maybe, but I wanted to see it. I needed to see what it looked like when the world met the woman I'd been too small to acknowledge. Vasquez was a compact woman in her 50s, with a voice like gravel and hands that moved when she talked, directing attention the way a conductor directs an orchestra. She looked at Claire's registration form, looked at Claire, asked 3 questions about supply chain bottleneck management. Claire answered in sentences that were complete, specific, and devoid of the qualifications women are trained to insert to make competence palatable. Vasquez assigned her to logistics coordination for the camp's southern sector 400 residents, food distribution, water allocation, medical triage scheduling. Claire accepted the assignment the way she'd accepted every crisis of the past 4 days, without ceremony, with immediate forward motion. I was assigned to the data team. Population tracking, resource modeling, arrival projections. The work was familiar: spreadsheets, models, probability curves translated into a medium where the variables were people instead of assets, and the downside risk was measured in lives instead of dollars. I was good at it, good the way I'd been good at the route map. Narrow, specific, useful within my lane. My lane. That was the restructuring, the understanding that had been assembling itself since Tuesday, since the bathtubs, since the plywood and the drill and the sawdust on Claire's forearms. For 11 years, I'd believed my lane was the whole road, that my way of processing the world analytical, measured, deliberate, was the superior mode. And Claire's way, intuitive, prepared, immediate, was a deviation from rationality that I was generous enough to tolerate. The truth was simpler and more expensive. Claire's lane and my lane were both real, but hers was wider. Hers encompassed mine. Her preparation included analysis. Her intuition was built on data. Her urgency was the product of calculation, not the absence of it. She'd been operating at a level of integrated intelligence that I'd mistaken for anxiety, because admitting its nature would have required admitting that my wife was better at the thing I built my identity around. I had called her overreacting because the alternative was calling her superior. That afternoon, I brought her lunch at the logistics tent. A tray from the communal kitchen: rice, canned vegetables, a square of cornbread. She was standing over a folding table covered in maps and lists, speaking with 2 other coordinators about water purification schedules. She took the tray without looking at it. "Thank you, Marcus. You need to eat." "I'll eat." "Claire." I waited until she looked at me. "I'll eat" means you'll forget. "Sit down. 5 minutes." She studied me. The assessment was visible. Is this worth the time? Is this a distraction? Is this the old Marcus trying to manage me, or the new Marcus trying to support me? I held her gaze and let her run the analysis. She sat. She ate. Not because I told her to. Because she decided the data supported it. We ate together on folding chairs outside the logistics tent, facing south, where the Virginia hills rolled green and gold in the afternoon light, and the world looked, from this angle, like a place where nothing had gone wrong. The camp sounds surrounded us: voices, generators, the distant thrum of a helicopter. And for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, we were 2 people sharing a meal in the sun. "The southern sector water margin is tight," she said between bites. I saw. "I'll adjust the projection model tonight." She looked at me. A different look. Not command, not assessment. Recognition. The look of a person seeing a partner where a passenger used to sit. "Good," she said. 1 word. It rebuilt a wall I'd spent 11 years eroding. We finished eating. We went back to work, separately, together. I thought my wife was overreacting. I said that word to her face on a Tuesday in July, while she knelt on our kitchen floor building the system that would save our lives. I said it in the voice I'd perfected, patient, measured, certain the voice of a man who believed that his calm was a contribution, and her urgency was a condition. She heard me say it. She told me she would remember. She did. The zombies surrounded us because the world broke exactly the way Claire predicted it would, on the timeline she'd calculated, along the vectors she'd mapped. And I survived, not because I adapted, or fought, or rose to the occasion. I survived because my wife had been rising for 6 weeks in silence, building the architecture of our salvation in the hours I was asleep, asking nothing from me but the one thing I wouldn't give: belief. I believe her now. Not because I'm wiser, because I was educated, and the tuition was 4.7 miles of proof that the woman I married had been the most competent person in every room I'd ever stood in with her. She doesn't need me to say so. She never did. But I say it anyway, every day, out loud.